I think it's a great honor that he let me just say this to you. He called us. I wouldn't have thought of calling him because I wouldn't have thought I had a chance of getting him to come to New York to do this. And he called us and said, you know, I've always loved the Conservative Party. I know you're doing the conference. I would be delighted if you would allow me an opportunity to participate in the conference. And a big smile came to my face. I thought to myself, well, that is an offer I will not refuse. I give you a famous member of the conservative movement since the Goldwater years, David Keene.
Thank you very much. And when I offered to come up, I didn't think I'd get a free meal out of the deal as well. So I'll go anywhere for that. The reason I'm here, frankly, a few years ago during the pandemic, my wife put together a small dinner for me on my birthday because we weren't able to celebrate in a big way as we'd like to, even though I was old enough to celebrate. And so we had maybe 18 or 20 people at a little venue. And Jim Buckley, my old friend, came to the dinner. And as we were cutting the cake, Jim leaned over and he said, David, I've been looking at the people at this table. And he said, I hope you realize that you and I have been friends longer than you've known any of them, and that includes your wife. And I had to acknowledge that that was right, and I got to thinking about the Conservative Party of New York and the connections we've had. I first met Jim Buckley not in his winning race, but in the race before that, when we got together up here. We've been very close friends since. In recent years, he's been in retirement in Bethesda, Maryland, before his death at the age of 100. And we would get together about once a month for dinner and talk about the old times. And one thing about somebody my age is I like to talk about the old times. So I called Jerry and I said, can I come up and talk about the old times? And he said, what the heck, we need somebody to speak. You know, the New York Conservative Party was formed in 1962 to help drag New York screaming, if necessary, away from the mindless liberalism of the 50s and 60s that had infected both of the state's major parties, and to provide a home for conservatives comfortable with neither. That was an important mission, and it was quite a mission. Organizing to fight for principle in New York, what we conservatives outside New York like to refer to as the belly of the beast. I can't tell you how heartening those of us outside New York found the work you were doing here. I was at the University of Wisconsin. I dropped out of school to work in the 1964 Goldwater campaign. We lost everything then, and conservatives were despondent. And then you folks appeared on the scene. You ran Bill Buckley for mayor of New York. You got out and worked, and around the country, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of conservatives said, you know, if they can do it, so can we. And we all got down to work, and that's thanks to what you were doing here in New York State. Today we live in a different world. Many of those who might have remained in the 60s and 70s to fight for a more conservative New York have fled to safer havens. But you remain, continuing the fight in the belly of the beast when it would have been easier to move to Florida or Texas. Florida for the weather, Texas for other reasons. Or just to abandon politics and hope for the best. But that's never been your way. As I sat down to think about what to say to you today, I was reminded of the beginning of a poem by one of the old Soviet Union's premier dissident poets. As others were fleeing to safe harbor in the West, Anna Akhmatova stayed to fight. During the darkest days of the Stalinist period, she began a poem called Requiem with the following words. Unmoved by the glamour of alien skies, by asylum in faraway cities, I chose to remain with my people. By staying to fight, Anna and thousands of others, with the help of a solidly anti-communist Pope, United States President Ronald Reagan, and Britain's Margaret Thatcher, finally consigned Soviet communism to the scrap heap of history. If New York is to recover, it will be thanks to you who have refused to abandon the field, regardless of the odds. Bad as New York is today, and thank goodness I'm not up here on the field of battle, imagine for a moment what it would be like had the Conservative Party not come into existence in 1962. Imagine how unwilling Republican Party leaders would have been to stand up for what's right had you not been there to prod them and to take names. For that and for your courage in our movement's darkest days, every conservative in this country owes you a debt of gratitude, and it's to pay tribute to what you've done that I wanted to come here today. I've had the honor and the pleasure of knowing and working with Kieran O'Doherty, and Dan Mahoney, Surf Maltese, Mike Long, and now Jerry. Mike Long was one of my closest friends for many years. He served on my board at the American Conservative Union while I was chairman of that organization. He was somebody I could always rely on, and frankly, I loved him. I still grieve for his loss. But we can all take some pleasure in the fact that he left the party in good hands and that you will continue that fight. I got to know many of you in the state while I was working for Jim Buckley in the 70s. As I indicated, Jim remained a close friend until his death. On his 100th birthday, a United States Senator from Alaska, Dan Sullivan, who had clerked for him when he had been in the appeals court, had decided he was going to pay tribute to him on the Senate floor. So Dan called me and he said, your job is to call Jim and get him up to the Senate for breakfast at the Senator's dining room, and then I'll send somebody to get him to bring him to the floor so he can bask in the congratulations of his colleagues and former colleagues for attaining his 100th birthday and for the service he's given to the nation. I said, that's fine, I'll do that. So I called Jim, and I told him what we had in mind that morning, and Jim said, Dave, tomorrow I will be 100 years old, and on my 100th birthday, I want to sit in this chair with a glass of wine and celebrate by myself quietly. So I had to call Dan back and say, Senator, I got to thinking about it, and when you're 100 years old, you can do any damn thing you please. So we had to go on without the distinguished former senator from New York. All in all, this tells you that my connection with you goes back a long way. I'm here, as I said, to thank you for what you've done during all those years, for never losing faith, for continuing to fight. When Kieran and Dan launched the party in the early 60s, it became home to many traditional Democrats, fed up with the Democratic Party that a senator of the time, a Democratic senator, described as the party of acid, amnesty, and abortion, and insisted on nominating taxers and spenders who wanted to spend on everything but national defense. Working and middle-class Democrats in the Northeast and the Midwest, Italians, Poles, Irish, and Eastern Europeans, who the Democrats had been able to count on, began to leave, driven away by the policies that the party was now adopting. But many of them balked at voting for or joining the Republican Party. In New York, the Conservative Party became their home because they were conservative by tradition, by outlook, and by belief. The same thing was happening elsewhere. I myself, my father was a union organizer for most of his life. My mother was the president of the International Women's Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers, and my first political activity was passing out literature in the snows of Wisconsin in the 1960 primary between Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy. We were Democrats. By 1964, I was a Goldwater Republican. My parents voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980 and never cast another Democratic vote. They were in many ways, in my family, as typical, and I'll bet is similar to what some of you here of my generation were going through at that very same time. Fortunately, in New York, you didn't have to abandon your former Democratic friends and say, I've become a Republican. You could go to the Conservative Party, and you could vote on the conservative line, and it was a little easier. And that was unique to New York and has been unique to New York. We had to go all the way at the same time, and it was tougher. Now, today, the same forces that persuaded these working class voters to move in the 60s are leading Hispanic and black voters to look for a new, more comfortable home. That voters they have counted on to simply do their bidding has come as quite a shock to progressive leaders. After Barack Obama's election in 2008, two leading Democratic strategists wrote a book predicting decades of progressive liberal victories. The prediction was based on their belief that demographic changes in this country would make it impossible for Republicans to win national elections in the future. They thought they could count on a solid block of votes from the black community, as they always have, and they believed that the so-called Hispanic community was just as solidly Democratic and could be not only counted on, but taken for granted as they'd taken the black community for granted for so many decades. Their expected electoral dominance was based on the view that this would never change. That hasn't proved to be the case. The first signs of that had already begun, that many of the voters they were counting on began 5, 6, 7 years ago to realize in relatively small numbers that the Democratic Party neither represents their interests nor respects them or their views. Many voters are waking up to the fact that they have much more in common with the middle and working class voters who abandoned the elitist-driven Democratic Party decades ago than they do with those who are now in charge of that party. Think about it. Harry Truman, John Kennedy, even George McGovern would feel uncomfortable in today's Democratic Party. There was a recent poll that tells us exactly the difference between the parties. We used to think it was a party between working and non-working and professional classes or this or that. It now turns out, as the poll was titled, it's them versus us. And the pollster analyzed the top 1%, the people who make at least $150,000 a year, live in urban areas, have a postgraduate degree, and compared them to the rest of the population. What did they find out? 77% of people in that category, them, believe in rationing. 55% believe we have too much freedom for the individual in this country and it should be cut back. 73% of them identify as Democrats, 14% as Republicans, and there are probably one or two wandering around in New York that are conservatives who've lost their way. 74% of them say in this time in which we're living today that their economic prospects are constantly improving. That's compared to 40% of the rest of the population. 86% of them have a favorable view of Congress. And I don't even think 86% of congressmen have a favorable view of Congress. 84% of them have a favorable view of President Joe Biden's performance in office. And a majority of them favor banning private air travel, private residential air conditioning, gas vehicles, gas stoves, and pretty much anything else that makes modern life more comfortable. Those are the people that control the Democratic Party, and that's the reason that things are beginning to change and providing new opportunities. The cracks that began earlier became obvious in 2016, when black and Hispanic voters in larger numbers began to abandon a woke Democratic Party they weren't really sure represented their interests. And it wasn't just because they thought the new Democratic elites were taking them for granted. It was because more and more of them were persuaded that the ideas they were being asked to support were simply wrong. What may have been a trickle back then has grown in recent years. The furious attempts of the progressive establishment to persuade anyone who will listen that anyone else who disagrees with them can only be in disagreement because they're racist thugs has smacks of desperation. It's not working. The voters they thought they could count on to vote as a bloc simply because of the color of their skin are increasingly reluctant to do so. A poll last week, for example, revealed that at present some 39% of Hispanic voters favored Donald Trump over Joe Biden as the 2024 election approaches. And in city after city, 4 or 5 or 6% more of the black voting population is beginning to move away from the Democratic Party. That's caused panic, because without those voters voting in a block, they're in trouble. But many of them, like those who came before them, are reluctant to move to a Republican Party they see as about as likely to stand with them today as Nelson Rockefeller and John Lindsay stood with you in an earlier day. The New York State Conservative Party, today as it did then, offers emerging conservative voters a more comfortable home, led by men and women who share their cultural, religious, and foreign policy views, who support rather than scheme to defund the police, who believe in the continuing greatness of the country, and who won't compromise at the drop of a hat. The strength of the conservative movement, the strength of the Conservative Party, lies in the fact that while our opponents care little about the individuals and families they supposedly represent, we know it's the individual and the family that are crucial to the functioning of a free society. We are conservatives because we are free men and women who won't be dictated to by elitists and fantasists. We live in a nation today dominated by progressives who believe our politics should be governed by the color of our skin, our sex, and their view of what's good for us. Many of you live in a city with a mayor who having once served as a law officer, should know better, but who has publicly suggested that the fear of violent crime by those who live in the city would abate if the media would just stop covering crime. We live in a country where for several years, the administration and its spokespeople and those who support it have said, there's no problem on the southern border, thinking that if we don't acknowledge that that problem exists, nobody's going to notice it. And they didn't until the buses started running to cities away from the southern border. We live in a country governed by men and women today who are more interested in their interests than in ours. And that provides us an opportunity. We live in a country with a president who speaks out of both sides of his mouth without even realizing he's doing so. A president who says he can tell the difference between good and evil but sidles up to evil in the Mideast and Asia. A president who says that to save democracy, he has to weaponize the government to go after those with whom he and his acolytes disagree, who targets Christians and parents who care about their kids' education as enemies of the state. His problem, and our opportunity, is that those he expects to go along with what he and his woke allies wish aren't buying it. His party is losing support within the very groups they need to remain in power. And that, I'm convinced, will continue, and it is the modern mission of the New York State Conservative Party here in this state to make sure that it does continue. Because people aren't as dumb as he thinks or needs them to be. Those who've already realized that the liberal progressive vision will destroy the values they find important are being joined by newly minted conservatives by the day. An increasing number of Jewish, Hispanic, and Black Americans are waking up to discover that they have more in common with us than with the progressives who've taken them for granted for so long. Their problem, like the problem who many moved right in the 60s and 70s, is that they aren't comfortable in a Republican Party they cannot really be sure they can rely on. Well, they can depend on you because you have a record they can trust and a banner to which they can rally and under which they can win the battle to restore the values we all share. The New York State Conservative Party was formed when many thought all had been lost, by men and women who wouldn't accept that and who stood and fought, had tremendous effect here in New York, elected an outstanding United States Senator and many officials here who made a difference and have made a difference and are continuing to make a difference on the quality of life here. Truth and common sense ultimately prevail, and the signs are there that your future will be brighter than perhaps any of us in this room realize today because of that commitment to freedom and your willingness to continue to work for common sense conservative solutions to real problems. All you have to do today is what you've always done. Work hard, stand for principles, and welcome all of those who will stand with you in the fight for a free, civil, and safe New York. I know you will. It's why if I were a New Yorker, I'd be a proud member of the New York State Conservative Party. And it's because even as someone from outside the state, I admire what you've done. I thank you for the toil that you've involved yourself in. And I'm convinced that your best days lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.